Hi everyone! In this last unit, we are finally at one of my all-time favorite topics, the organ systems. But don't worry, we won't go through all 11 organ systems in these last four chapters for the semester. We will just cover digestive, cardiovascular, respiratory, urinary, and the reproductive system. Just five systems. Most of these organ systems will be discussed according to the human body's point of view, but we will discuss some of the evolutionary adaptations that some animals have for their specific lifestyles, which can be quite interesting to see how they differ from us humans. And it's amazing how natural selection always selects the best trait that allows the animal to survive. And in this chapter 41, we will discuss the animal nutrition, which basically summarizes key points about the nutrients we need, the different diets of different groups of animals, and the four stages of digestion, the organs of the digestive system, and their functions according to the human body, as well as adaptations to other animals' diet. And we will end the chapter with a quick glimpse of the hormones that are involved in regulating digestion, which is really critical because a lot of conditions, diseases we have with the digestive systems a lot of times goes with malfunctioning or malregulation of those particular hormones. So that's why I kind of slide it in there as a last thing to wrap up this particular chapter. All right, with that, let's get started. So, as we have talked about in a previous chapter, all animals are heterotrophs, and we say that they must consume food by eating other animal or plant matters. Um, so those particular foods goes back to the food groups we talked about back from Bio 1406, which were the macromolecules of life. Your carbohydrates, which is your sugars, complex sugars, your proteins, which is your polypeptide chains of amino acids, and also lipids, which are made up of fatty acids along with whatever is linking them together, like glycerol in the case of triglycerides. So all of these three things are basically what we animals use as energy and also, basic organic molecules to build more molecules, cells, and tissues that we need in our own body. So all of this, consumption of these food for those purposes is what we call nutrition or define as nutrition. Now, adequate diet must satisfy three basic needs. First of all, you must have some sort of chemical energy for cellular processes. That's the whole point of making ATP. That's the whole point of cellular respiration, is to break down those bonds, chemical bonds within ATP molecules that releases those energy that we can use for processes such as DNA replication, cell division, or even more macro scale things like our vision, hearing, etc. All of those muscle contraction, all of those are macro scale things that we have to have chemical energy for. And without enough nutrition, we are not going to have the energy to power those processes. Second thing, organic building blocks must be consumed in a lot of times for building our macromolecules. I know it sounds counterintuitive. It's kind of like taking a Lego set that someone owns and you take it as your own, and then you're going to break it all apart and then rebuild a Lego set of some sorts. So it's kind of like that. But a Lego set that someone else build doesn't mean it's something you like that you want to display or use for your own needs. So you take that Lego set, break it apart into little pieces of Legos, and you rebuild it into something that you like and you can use for your own purposes. And that's basically a great analogy of what organic building blocks means when we are ingesting materials. So this is talking about biosynthesis of organic carbon, which then is what we gather from sugars. And then organic nitrogen is what we gather from our proteins. Sugar, of course, is our carbohydrates or glucose itself. Third adequate thing that we have to have is essential nutrients. We tend to think of just the macromolecules as a part of our nutrition, but it actually is very important for us to have ions and vitamins, minerals, etc. So usually these are called essential, meaning that this is a requirement in our diet. We can't build these things. That's why it's called essential. Something we can't build ourselves, so we have to ingest it. And what these nutrients are usually used for are enzyme substrates, like something that binds to enzyme in order for the enzyme to work properly. Coenzymes, cofactors. We talked about things that enhances the function or speed or rate of the enzyme, make the active site fit a little better for the substrate, etc. Those are what coenzymes, cofactors are really doing, and they're a part of our essential nutrients. In addition to that, we will discuss how animals can extract the nutrients they need from the food they eat, but yet they don't digest their own tissues because we're talking about enzymes, digestive enzymes that break down macromolecules. But yet in our own cells, we have our own macromolecules as well. I mean, we can't be breaking down our own nucleic acids. That would be a big problem. We can't be breaking down our own ribosomes, then we ourselves can't make any protein synthesis. So, what is it in our body that allows for us to digest food yet not harming our own cells? It's part of what we'll talk about in this particular chapter. We'll talk about the uptake of nutrients and water into the bloodstream, how nutrients are absorbed, and then what are some protective secretions we have in our digestive organs to prevent our own cells from, being digested. So that's another key point of this chapter. So let's start with essential nutrients. Let's might start by talking about that. So essential nutrients include specific amino acids, any of those 20, and we'll talk about which specific one we need, and then the or how many we need. We don't. I thought I went ahead and thought that I won't make you memorize which amino acids we need. I'll talk about that in a bit. But there's fatty acids as well, vitamins that we can't make, minerals we can't make. So again, essential nutrients means these are specific molecules that we cannot synthesize in the body, and we have to ingest it from our environment. So let's start with talking about essential amino acids. So essential amino acids means that we're talking about things that we cannot just make in our own body system. There are those that we can make, and it turns out that most animals can make about 10 of those 20 amino acids. Remember, there are 20 amino acids available to make a protein. I kind of always say that it's kind of like our alphabet. We have 26 alphabet to make up all the millions of words, gazillions of sentences we can have. Analogous to that is we have 20 amino acids, and we can make millions and gazillions of different combinations of sequences of proteins possible to make structure for structural purposes, enzymatic purposes, everything you can imagine. Protein is very important for every cell's function. So, and on the contrary, plants and microorganisms can actually make all 20. Because if you imagine a plant, they can't really eat. So what they can do is just absorb minerals and nutrients from the soil, and amino acids are kind of big for that. So that's why they have their own mechanisms of making all 20 of these amino acids that they need. Same with microorganisms. But the other 10 that we can't make are what we call then the essential amino acids because we cannot make them and we have to eat them from food. So a complete set of essential amino acids means that we can be acquired from proteins in animals. So a complete essential amino acids means that those are usually what we get from animals such as meat, eggs, and cheese, such that when we eat these items, we can get all of the essential amino acids that we need. Now, incomplete essential amino acids means that, well, for example, when we eat plant material, a lot of times some plant material won't have one or even more number of essential amino acids. They don't provide all 20 that we have. So we cannot just eat one type of plant and expect us to get all the protein we need ever in our life. So hence, those of us that are vegetarians or those animals that are herbivores usually have to eat a mixture of plant products. One example of that is corn. Corn, even though we love it and it has a lot of sugars to, power for energy, it does lack two of the 20 amino acids, which is tryptophan and lysine, both of which are one of those essential ones we need. And they say that humans actually need eight amino acids, eight specific one. They have a list in the book if you're curious about which eight, but I thought I didn't want to include it in here, and don't because I don't expect you to memorize which eight exactly do you need. And then for infants, babies, they need one more amino acid, which is why we have formula milk and also breast milk for the babies, is because they get all those amino acids, essential amino acids, from those items. Now, beans is another type of vegetable that can lack methionine, because people are like, oh, I can get my proteins from eating beans. They have a lot of proteins. Well, what some beans don't have methionine. And methionine is one of the essential amino acids that humans need, which is why if you are a vegetarian or an animal is an herbivore, they will need to eat a mixture of plant products. So in this particular picture here, it kind of summarizes those four specific essential nutrients we need. And we just talked about essential amino acids. We're talking about amino acids that we can't make but have to ingest. So they're talking about how this particular enzyme called fatty acid desaturase actually have or made up of amino acids that we have to ingest itself, which is why I said proteins serve as a very important function as enzymes. In this particular case, it actually turns linoleic acid into another form of excuse me, I can't speak today, gamma linoleic acid. And this gamma linoleic acid is actually very critical for making phospholipids in cell membranes and also for making prostaglandin that's used in cell cycling, which is what we talk about in the next part. Essential fatty acids. What are fatty acids that we cannot make and we have to ingest? So this is usually, like I said, required for making our plasma membrane, which is made up of phospholipids. Some are important for signaling molecules like hormones. And then lastly, storage of fat material, also very critical because we need always have a storage of energy in our bodies. We can't expect ourselves to eat just the right amount and then never have any reserve. That is not what our body tends to do or likes to do. Our body likes to store energy. Okay, we're think back think not of modern days where we have access to food just in our fridge or the supermarket. Think of back in caveman age where they have to go hunt or go farm for their food. So they can have some period of time where they don't have access to food if they can't hunt anything or the weather doesn't suit for farming at all. So this is why humans, especially back in the day, it is essential to store up some energy in terms of fat. All right, so animals actually lack enzymes to form double bonds, which are found in certain fatty acids. So we talked about back in Bio 1406, saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and unsaturated fat is the one that have double bonds. And we actually use those for producing some of those things we just talked about with phospholipids, signaling molecules, etc. So we must gather these type of fatty acids from our diet, and we can get them from seeds, grains, and also vegetables. And one of those essential fatty acid that we cannot produce is linoleic acid, which you see how it has a little kink here. I talked about in Bio 1406 how presence of a double bond in, let's say, a saturated fatty acid, unsaturated fatty acid actually makes a kink because of the fact that you have C, double bond C, and then kind of like that. All the carbons in saturated area is kind of have this long strand that goes like this and long strand that goes like that. So that's why we always talk about in sense of having a kink in the molecule, which is why they say unsaturated fat is more healthy compared to saturated fat, because saturated fat are just one long linear molecule with not much of a three-dimensional shape. So what these linear molecules like to do in your bloodstream is they tend to like to stack on top of each other, which can, contribute to formation of plaque in your blood vessels, which is why, saturated fat is what we call unhealthy, quote unquote, type of fat. You can eat it, but just don't overindulge on it, because the more of those you have in your bloodstream, the more likely they will start to stack on top of each other and give you plaque, arteriosclerosis, and possibly heart attack or stroke. So this is why unsaturated fat with a little kink actually, and kind of disable them from stacking on top of each other, or make it harder, less chances, less likelihood of stacking on top of each other. So they end up being able to float just fine in your bloodstream. So that's why then we call those unsaturated fat as a healthy fat, which are then you can gather from seeds, grains, and vegetables. Now, why linoleic acid is, important is that we can actually use, there are certain enzymes that take linoleic acid and turn them into different forms, gamma form, alpha forms, whatever it is. But this is what we commonly known as our omega-6 and omega-3. Those that are the ones that we use for specific purposes. So remember, omega-6 is the one that is used for phospholipids, and also for producing prostaglandin. You're like, what is prostaglandin? Well, prostaglandin is something we talk about in AMP when we talk about wound healing, for example, in terms of blood vessel. When you bleed, what happens is that you need to clot, and prostaglandin actually play a role in that facilitation of clotting. And then there's also pain and inflammation that prostaglandin play a role as well. I won't go deep into that. And then omega-3 is actually essential then for human growth and development, especially for the brain, which is why omega-3 is an essential ingredient when we talk about prenatal vitamins, because a baby needs to develop a whole brain from a little embryo. So that's why you need to make sure you have omega-3 in your diet or in forms of supplement in order to produce, in order for the baby to develop their nervous system properly. Now, something interesting is that even though something is good for you, does not mean you overindulge on it. I've heard many times where people are like, "Oh, that's good for me. Let me eat just like 10 times the amount of what's suggested on the label because it's good for me, right? So I can just eat a lot of it, but that will make it even better." Now, that's something interesting about our body, is that our body works by balance, or the fancy term for that in biology, homeostasis. Every organ system in your body is working with homeostasis, which means when something is too low, yes, that's not a good story, as we have just talked about. You can't build these things, etc. You can't build phospholipids. But if you eat too much of it, it's a problem too. They say that if you indulge on too much omega-6 or linoleic acid, it actually causes bleeding and alter some immune functions, and also can lead to heart problems, etc., etc. So it is very important that just because something is good for you, you don't overindulge or overeat on that particular item, because you don't know what it will do. Our body works by homeostasis. That is the central theme in anatomy and physiology too. Part two is because of the fact that we talk about all these organ systems, and it always is balance of temperature, balance of heart, balance of blood pressure, balance of pH, etc. Same thing for digestive system. Homeostasis of nutrients is also very critical. All right, and then you see here that there is a vitamin and a mineral within this that participate in the function of these enzymes. This is where I talked about cofactors, coenzyme that enhances or is essential for the enzyme to do its job. So in this case, there's a vitamin called vitamin B3 that is a source, or our body kind of turns it into NADH. And if you remember what NADH is, it's an ingredient in our cellular respiration. I'll talk about that when we get to those particular vitamins. And then there's a mineral here where there is iron is critical for this particular enzyme to function. And for mineral iron, other than this particular enzyme, another critical protein that require the use of iron is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is packed in our red blood cells and it is critical for binding oxygen. So if you don't have iron, you cannot make enough red blood cells. You will end up being anemic. But at the same time, you can overindulge of iron, ingest iron as well. I'll talk about that in a bit. All right, so let's talk about the essential vitamins now. So these are usually organic molecule because important they're organic because that's what separates vitamins from minerals. Minerals are actually inorganic. So vitamins are organic molecules that are required in, notice, very small amounts. We don't need a lot of it in our lives. So this is when some, again, going back to, oh, that vitamin is good for me. Okay, let me like just take 3,000, 5,000 milligrams of that vitamin. Most vitamins you probably need maybe 1,000, depending which. There's a range depending which particular vitamin it is. But some are up to 2,000 milligrams, but you don't need 5,000, 100,000 milligrams of vitamins. And in some cases, it can be a very bad story for you. I'll get to that when I talk about, what are the adverse effects of not having enough or having too much of particular vitamins. So for humans, there are 13 essential vitamins that we have to ingest through our diet. You don't have to know all of these. I'll highlight some of which you have to know. One of those being vitamin B2 or riboflavin. Why? Is because when you don't, well, first of all, what you use B2 for is to make FAD. Remember, FAD is what we use again for cellular respiration, just like NADH. So we call FAD a coenzyme. So it is a functional component of the coenzyme FAD for cellular respiration, and it has pretty, bad consequences when you don't have enough of them, such as skin lesions or cracks at the corners of the mouth. Other than dehydration, sometimes it can also be a sign of not having enough vitamin B2 in your body, and you can actually get those, of course, as a supplement or from meat products, dairy products, grains, vegetables, etc. Now, for vitamin B3, then is the other coenzyme that is important for cellular respiration, which is NAD and NAD+, okay, which what we use for ATP synthesis by cellular respiration. So again, when you don't have enough of this particular vitamin, you can have skin and gastrointestinal lesions, just like your riboflavin. And you can, for behavior-wise, you can have delusions and confusion as well. So these you can get from nuts, meats, and grains. Second group that is important and I want you to bring your attention to is folic acid, which is actually vitamin B9. And folic acid, I'll talk about the whole story, at the end, close to the, latter part of the chapter, where when you don't have enough folic acid, it can be a serious matter when you are pregnant because fetus or embryos will need these essential nutrient in order for proper neural tube development. And neural tube, as we have talked about in a previous chapter, is critical for enclosing your spinal cord and the brain. So very important for nervous system. And nervous system, you can't live without one. Okay, so this is why it's very critical for you, a pregnant mom to have enough folic acid in their diet. I'll talk about that story again in the later chapter. It can also lead to anemia problems when you don't have enough folic acid. And they say usually folic acid is very abundant in very green vegetables. The darker green the vegetable is, the more folic acid it has. So notice that's why it doesn't say just vegetables, but green vegetables. Of course, it also comes as a supplement. Like a pill over the counter, but oranges, nuts, legumes, also whole grains have these folic acid in there. Second is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 we talk about in for the human body because when you don't have enough of that, you actually end up with anemia of some sort, numbness, and loss of balance. So this is actually a very critical component for making red blood cells. So when we talk about what is essential for producing red blood cells, we actually, which is actually erythropoiesis for making red blood cells. The process is called that. But you need vitamin K and vitamin B12. Okay, so that's why vitamin K I'll highlight in a bit too. But you can easily get B12 again, a supplement, meat, eggs, dairy products. Vitamin C we all know is very critical for our immune system. So other than immune system purposes, is actually used in collagen synthesis. And we just learned from previous chapter that collagen is super important for structural protection or structural support of your cells. So if you don't have enough vitamin C, you're not going to get enough collagen in your cells. In addition, antioxidant is another function of vitamin C in your body, which is why it's good for your immune system. Okay, when you're sick and things like that, there's toxins in your body that antioxidants can help with getting rid of. So you can get those from citrus fruits, broccoli, tomatoes. Now, if you don't have enough vitamin C in your body, it can lead to scurvy, and scurvy is really a disease or condition that results in degeneration of your skin, which is why in this particular picture right here, you see some skin being raw, okay, or like the outer layer surface of the skin is gone. There's a lot of lesions in the body, bloody lesions, because your outer external skin is gone. A big portion of our skin, including your dermis layer of the skin, is made up of collagen. Lots of collagen in the dermis layer. So when you don't have enough collagen there, probably, skin can't even be made properly. So that's why you end up with lesions. And then there's also degeneration of your teeth as well. People's teeth would actually fall out when they don't have enough vitamin C. So that's why that whole condition of having skin lesions, raw skin, and also teeth, teeth that are wiggly or falling out, that's a scurvy condition. There's also can be delayed wound healing because collagen, again, very critical for wound healing. I always say wound healing is kind of like sewing. When you have a hole on your pants or your skirt, you end up having to grab a patch somewhere and sew it up. So collagen is kind of part of that sewing process, sewing that that wound up. So that's why you need collagen and vitamin C in order for that to happen properly. And next group is the vitamin A, D, E, and K. You have to know these because all of these we talk about for the human body. Okay, vitamin A, you've heard it before. Where do we have vitamin A from? Carrots, right? So this is why, your mom used to say, maybe when you were a kid, eat your carrots. I know you don't like your carrots, but you got to eat it because carrots have a lot of retinol, which is vitamin A. And vitamin A is very critical for your vision purposes. So if you don't have enough vitamin A, it can lead to blindness, or even not sufficient enough can lead to specifically night blindness. So in that case, because you don't have enough vitamin A, your eyesight don't function properly. So that's why sometimes it can be more pronounced when it's dark in a dark area. Skin disorder, impaired immunity can also be a consequence of not having enough vitamin A. So major functions in the body is to make those visual pigments within the retina layer of your eyeball. I won't go into too deep into that. And then vitamin D. Okay, vitamin D, very critical. Okay, vitamin D is actually important for absorption of calcium and phosphorus. So we've already talked about in a previous chapter that your strong bones, or ossified bones, come from deposits of calcium, sometimes specifically calcium phosphate. And in that case, when we eat calcium or ingest things with phosphorus and calcium in it, in order for our body to absorb those specific ions, calcium and phosphorus, you need vitamin D. Vitamin D is what essentially, I'm not going to go through the whole step of what does it make to tell the intestine what to do. But let's say just go through the end product here, is that vitamin D makes something that tells your intestine to absorb calcium and phosphorus. And those are important for ossifying your bones. So when you don't have enough vitamin D, you can eat as much calcium as you want. You will never be able to absorb them, and your bones will be very brittle. Or too flexible in that sense. Too flexible, excuse me, not brittle, but too flexible. So that's why people that don't have enough vitamin D, they actually get what's called rickets. Rickets is when the bones are too flexible, such that your upper body's trunk weight is bearing on those leg bones, and they can actually curve just like that when you don't have enough strength in your bones. Okay. So all you got is probably collagen, because I've mentioned that bones is made up of, especially for humans, one third of it is collagen, 2/3 of it is calcium. Um, So, or calcium crystals. So that's why calcium is really the strength part of it. So when you don't have calcium, all you got is collagen. You get the flexibility, but you don't got the strength. So this is why vitamin D is super important. But thankfully, vitamin D is one of those vitamins that we can make, but we just have to go out into the sun. Okay. So we have to go out in the sun and then just get some sunlight. Now, not too much. Again, there's that homeostasis. You can't go out into the sun. You're like, oh, vitamin D, let me stay in the sun for 10 hours. Okay, that actually gives you higher chance of skin cancer. So don't overindulge on the sunlight either. But some sunlight is necessary. No one can just stay out of the sunlight forever in their lives because that rickets can be a big problem. All right, and then vitamin E, which is actually very important for nervous system. When you don't have it, it can lead to its degeneration. Vitamin K, I've already talked about that as being part of very important for blood clotting process. So if you don't have enough vitamin K, you might bleed or have a harder time stopping bleeding because the clots don't form properly. Now, we said that these are essential vitamins that you have to have in your body for these particular processes, but remember, when you have overdose problem of any of these vitamins, it can be an issue. Now, if notice that this group up here, that right here, is labeled as water soluble vitamins, which means they can dissolve in aqueous solution, such as your bloodstream and hence your urine. So any usually extra of those water soluble vitamins we eat maybe is a less of a problem, even if you you overdose on them, because they can be excreted in urine easily. So usually maybe when you're sick, you're like, well, let me take that extra vitamin C just in case it helps with me recovering faster. Well, you will see when you pee a couple hours or the day after that, you might see that it looks greenish, almost greenish tinge color when you look into your toilets after you pee. And that greenish tinge is from all the vitamin C that are just coming right out of your system because they're not being used. It's extra stuff that your body didn't use up. So that's why for water soluble vitamins, it's okay, because they can be just come out right out of your body. What can be a bigger problem is if you overdose in fat soluble vitamins, which are then that means they are lipids. If they are lipids, then they cannot dissolve in blood or urine. They cannot pass into the urine. So what happens with these fat soluble vitamins is they are accumulated in your body fat instead of urine, because that's where they would go. Lipids like lipids. So they would go towards the lipid area, which is your adipose tissue. And adipose tissue, of course, stays in your body and they can accumulate to very toxic levels. So you got to be careful with fat soluble vitamins that you don't overdose on those, which is why I always say you have to consult your doctor. If you think you're lacking a particular vitamin, we're not talking about the water soluble ones, but let's say fat soluble ones. Make sure you consult with your doctor before you take a certain amount of this particular vitamin for fat soluble ones, because it can have detrimental effects, as we've talked about, here with the being toxic. All right. Last type of or group of essential nutrients is your minerals, which are inorganic, key term there, inorganic nutrients that are required again in small amounts such as iron and sulfur. When we already talked about some ingredients we can use irons for, such as your enzyme for the linoleic acid transformation, and then also iron for hemoglobin processing or producing. So here are a couple of them that can be essential. So make sure you know all of it. A lot of it is important for your body. So you have calcium. I already talked about is very important for bones. So if you don't have enough calcium, you will have osteoporosis, or more likely to develop osteoporosis later in your lifetime. And you have, decreased bone mass and bone density, which is not good. Okay, your bones will end up being too brittle in this case. Without calcium, you end up having weak bones. You lose the strength part of the bones, which makes your bones kind of porous like this and very weak, very prone to fractures. Phosphorus is what we can use for, again, bones, because we did say calcium phosphate is what we deposit into our bones. So again, when you don't have enough of this, it can lead to calcium loss and also loss of bone mass. Sulfur is important for making certain amino acids. Okay, so just like kind of like the nitrogens. So if you don't have enough of sulfur in your diet, it can have impaired growth, fatigue, and swelling. Potassium is a very important ingredient in nerve function. We talked about that. If you've taken anatomy before, you learn about electroconduction of or electrophysiology of a neuron, and there's two essential ions that are critical for action potential production. So that is your sodium ions and potassium ions. So which is why sodium ions and potassium ions here are important for nerve function. They do similar things. So if you don't have enough potassium ion or sodium ion, it can lead to some sort of muscular problems, either weakness, paralysis, or even heart failure. That's scary, right? And then for sodium, it can lead to muscle cramps or reduced appetite as well. For chloride ions, it is a negative ion that is important for acid-base balance. Again, this is something we talk about in anatomy and physiology too, where chloride ion actually serve to sort of what we call chloride shift type of reaction. Okay, and they actually exchange, do a little counter transport with bicarbonate. And bicarbonate, we'll talk about in this chapter, serves as a very important role in buffer, which neutralizes acid conditions. So if you don't have enough chlorine, it will end up being you having muscle cramps and also reduce appetite, just like sodium. Magnesium, it is actually a very important enzyme cofactor for ATP bioenergetics. Again, you will have some sort of nervous system problems when you don't have enough magnesium. Iron, I already talked about. I'm not going to go back to that. Fluoride is, you've heard of that, which is why we have fluoride toothpaste because it actually helps with tooth structure. So if you don't have enough fluoride, you can have tooth decay more often. Iodine is actually very important for production of thyroid hormones. So when you don't have iodine, it can actually lead to hypothyroidism. And what is hormones important for is for metabolism. So when you have thyroid hormone at normal levels, we can metabolize the food we eat into energy. That's what metabolism defines as, is the cellular respiration part of it, making of ATP. But when you don't have enough thyroid hormones, you're not going to be able to do cellular respiration, and you're not going to have enough ATP. So that will be very critical especially when we're talking about a growing child or a growing embryo inside the mother's womb, because when the mother is hypothyroid, that's a big problem because your thyroid hormone you make, especially in the first trimester of the baby's formation, they take the mom's thyroid hormone. And during that first trimester, we already talked about embryogenesis is so important in that first few stages because everything that is critical for the survival of the embryo is forming in that stage: the heart, the lungs, the brain, the spinal cord, etc. So it is very important that the baby grows at a proper rate. And when you don't have enough thyroid hormones, it cannot metabolize things into, it cannot make ATP, which of course ATP is super important for cell growth. So when you don't have that, you're not going to have enough growth of the baby. So when babies don't have enough thyroid hormones, they can either be miscarried because they're not growing properly, or you will have a very tiny baby as well. So that's a very important thing, is have enough iodine in your diet for the production of thyroid hormones, which is then this is what we use for what the thyroid gland use to make thyroid hormones is the iodine. When you don't have enough, you can have actually an enlarged thyroid gland as well. No, enlarged thyroid gland doesn't necessarily means you have hyperthyroidism. It could be because there's not enough ingestion of iodine. So you will form a goiter on the neck, which is kind of looks like this, a little bulge on the side or on the front of your neck, because where the thyroid gland is, if you imagine your neck and shoulders, it's a little blood butterfly gland. But they call it the butterfly shaped gland that's right there at the base of your throat, right between your clavicles, if you think your clavicles are right there. So that's why this particular area can be enlarged, or the sides of it can be enlarged for when you have a goiter. Um, But if you have hyperthyroidism, that can also lead to nodules that can enlarge as well on the thyroid gland, that can lead to something that looks like that as well. So it depends. And you just have to get it checked out by the doctor to see whether you have some kind of thyroid problems. Are you hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, making too much or too little thyroid hormones? But you have to have, so now if you're hyperthyroid, you better not be ingesting any more iodine because you already have too much thyroid hormones, which is a bad thing for your body because you're doing too much metabolism. You can lose weight unhealthily, and your heart rate goes up like crazy when you have hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism, then you can't do any cell growth, you're lethargic, you're tired, and very critical when you're talking about child or embryo that is still growing, needing all those ATP for cell growth purposes and developmental purposes. All right, so like I said, you just because these minerals are good for us, you cannot have too much of them. It can lead to a whole variety of health problems. So, for example, just to name two, when you have too much sodium, it actually can lead to high blood pressure. So they say that high blood pressure, is exacerbated by having too much sodium in your diet. I won't go into the details of that, but it has to do with osmosis and, tonicity inside your body that we talk about in AMP. But having too much sodium leads to high blood pressure. So, which is why people with high blood pressure already better not be ingesting too much sodium. Now, that includes processed foods because a lot of processed foods, even though they may not taste salty, but they usually and oftentimes have a lot of sodium in it. So, they say a typical person in the United States consumes about 20 times more sodium than it is required for the body. So I guess we won't be too worried about having too low sodium in our case. But you got to be more aware if you have, someone with high blood pressure or a family member of high blood pressure, you got to let them know you cannot take that salt because it would lead to water going into your bloodstream. And hence, that is why you end up with a high blood pressure. All right, if you have too much iron, because iron, they say, hey, it's good for our enzymes, it's good for our hemoglobin, but if you have too much of it, it actually causes an excessive buildup in storage sites. Our body likes to store iron, in particular transport proteins that, we won't get into. But those particular iron get stored. So if you have too much of them, it actually can lead to liver and heart disease when you have too much iron. So just because you're anemic or you think you're anemic because you're faint, you're fatigued all the time, you're kind of pale in color, don't just go ingest whatever iron into in your body. Okay. You can eat meat, but eat more meat or something for red meat for iron, but don't overindulge on supplements of iron because iron can be built up to a toxic level. So again, if you think you're anemic, always go to the doctor to ask for their professional opinion on how much more iron you need to take, what exact dosage do you need for you to be healthy. All right, so well, now on to then diets. Animals, as we've talked about, have diverse diets. Some like to eat plants, some like to eat only meat, and some like to eat both. So here's definition of the three types of diets animals have. If you only eat plants or algae, okay, notice they put plant or algae because now we know plants or algae are not plants. So that's why they put plants or algae in the textbook. So herbivores are those that eat or animals that feed mainly on plants and algae, such as your cattle, cow, sheep, pigs, etc. Those are cattle. Sea slugs, as we've talked about before in the previous chapter, we talked about invertebrates, and then caterpillars as well. They feed and feed and feed on plant material such as leaves until they go through metamorphosis. Again, something we talked about about insects. Okay, and then carnivores are then those that feed on other animals, such as sea otters with ingest on invertebrates, and also fishes, etc. Hawks, which is a bird, also ingests only meat. Spiders only ingest meat, but they're not eating beef or pig or pork for that matter. Spiders are ingesting other insects, which provide their protein needs for the spider themselves. And then omnivores, which are then those animals that feed on plants and animals. So that's us as humans. We ingest plants, algae. We also, we eat a whole variety of items. So bears, crows, and also roaches share the same omnivores with us humans. Now, given that, even though we say, oh, this animal is an herbivore, this particular animal is a carnivore, they say that most animals are actually called what's called opportunistic feeders, which means if, let's say, you're a herbivore, but there's no other food groups available, there's no plants available in the wild, your body can actually then go ahead and eat the other stuff that actually keeps you alive, okay? Because according to the body, they're like, well, eating this is better than dying. So they can actually eat other foods or metabolize other food if your usual food source isn't available. It might not be optimal. You might not digest that particular food properly or as well as if you were eating those that were in your food source or food preference, but it's better than dying, not, or starving to death. So one example is herring gulls. Herring gulls like to eat, for example, you see a sea star in its mouth, so it likes to eat echinoderms. So echinoderms. So herring gulls will eat those marine invertebrates, insects, and also small fishes. But let's say wherever they're at, none of these are available, then they can also eat human feces. Yes, human feces, fecal matter, because they can actually get whatever leftover nutrient is in the particular human feces. So, but of course, that is what do you call that? Not abnormal, but like an unusual food source for herring gulls. They would not eat human feces if there's a nice fish next to them. Okay, but it is what they have to do if that is what it takes for them to survive. Deer are usually herbivores, but they will also eat insects, worms, or excuse me for misspelling that, bird eggs, if they need to, because that's what it takes just for them to survive, they will. That's what it means to be opportunistic feeders. Now, if a diet lacks one or more of these essential nutrients that we talked about, or if it doesn't provide enough energy resource, because that's two different things. We need essential nutrients as building blocks for a lot of things or for enzymes to function properly. On top of that, we need food source or diet for energy, making ATP. So when we don't have enough of either of those things, this is when we have a state of malnutrition. So in essential nutrient deficiency can lead to a bunch of things because you're like, oh, malnutrition, what can that lead to? Well, it can lead to deformities, because especially if we're talking about a growing animal, okay, whether it be a child or a baby animal. It can lead to a lot of different variety of diseases or even, of course, death. So deer and other herbivores can actually develop fragile bones if the plants they eat grew in what's called the phosphorus deficient soil. Let's say in that particular soil where the plants are growing, don't have enough phosphorus, because then those plant materials won't have phosphorus. And when the deer eat that particular plant, they're not going to get enough phosphorus from that particular that area of plants. So they got to go elsewhere. And it's amazing. These animals just know what their body is lacking and need, and instinctively will go look for other sources of those essential nutrients. So, for example, they can compensate by eating unusual resources that they usually don't unless they're lacking in something. So, you might find deers like this that lick salts from rocks. I think they say this is specifically rocks from the alpine. So that's where they can actually, those rocks specifically have salt on the surfaces that they can lick in order to ingest some of those essential nutrients, minerals in this particular case. Birds may actually eat snail shells for, again, those essential nutrients. Tortoises may actually eat eat stones. So they will eat rocks if they need to for those essential nutrients. So these are pretty interesting things that, again, going back to the opportunistic feeders, if we don't have this, they will go to other resources for those specific essential nutrients or energy resource. All right. So when you don't have a diet that gives you enough chemical energy, okay, that is what we call undernourishment. Such that your diet do not provide you with enough energy or ATP to power your cells and processes. So usually undernourishment can come from a whole variety of different events, such as climate catastrophes. Okay, some climate catastrophes. If all of a sudden there's global cooling or something, or there's ice age in somewhere, it can actually kill off a lot of species in terms of plants or animals, which then whatever feeds on those specific plants or animals, they might not have their food. War is another very common reason for undernourishment. Now, war is not a time where we can just, indulge in whatever we want to eat. Um, Turkey, I guess the more recent war tragic cases is Turkey, what happened in Turkey. But, that's an good example of people just, starving over there. And then pandemics also led to, I mean, for us in the US, it wasn't too bad of a deal, but there was a slight panic attack when we had COVID-19 pandemic, where people say, oh, go store up your food, buy tons of those toilet papers. Remember those days? But no, but it turns out we have a lot of toilet papers available, and it is not an essential nutrient. We won't go eat toilet papers, but they did say to, stock up your fridge, stock up your dry foods so you can survive just in case somehow all transportation halts and everything cannot be shipped properly, and now you don't have food stores available near you. So that was the case too. Eating disorders, health conditions can also lead to undernourishment. Psychological problems such as anorexia nervosa, which is a case where, patients restrict their food intake by severely eating less. We're talking about severely eating less. On top of that, a lot of times excessive exercising. And on top of that, sometimes a combination of purging food as well. They may appear to be eating a lot in front of other people, but they may ingest laxatives or vomit after they eat, such that whatever they just ate comes right back out of their digestive system. They don't absorb anything, and they just look skinnier and skinnier and skinnier to a non-healthy state. So patients usually with this condition do not realize that their body is fading away, and oftentimes require interventions of some sort because it is considered as a psychiatric problem condition. So what does your body do when you are under this undernourishment state of mind or state of the body? Well, first of all, your body will try to use any stored carbohydrates you have and fat resources that you have. So this is why if you, let's say, restrict your diet, go on a restrict diet, or go exercise, burn more calories, you end up losing weight, is because then you're using those fat tissues that you have stored up for the body. Now, after you deplete all the fat resources available, or carbohydrates, you stop eating carbohydrates. Well, then your body will turn to the next macromolecule for energy, which is proteins. Now, remember, proteins is a resource of energy we don't ever want to use. It is kind of like your last resort for the body. Remember, I said protein is very critical for a lot of different functions in the body, and we don't want to be using it for energy. We have carbohydrates and fat for that, lipids for that purposes. So when your body starts to break down proteins for energy, a lot of times it goes for your muscles, because your skeletal muscles are full of actin and myosin, which are proteins that build up your muscle fibers. So muscles will usually start to shrink. On top of that, your brain will become protein deficient. And brain, you need critical proteins because they are the guys that are making neurotransmitters that allows you to have a life, in a sense. Without neurotransmitters, everything shuts down in the body. It just doesn't work properly, and you can be dead. So when you get to a point where you have really, really low in protein resources, burn out all the proteins available in your skeletal muscles, your brain is now no longer making enough neurotransmitter. You're close to that dying stage. And last but not least is that you can have possible then irreversible tissue and organ damage, and like I said, even death, when you just keep starving yourselves that way, or you don't have a choice but to starve yourself in these other conditions, for example. So you can have, even though, let's say, you were able to survive through those times without food, but then you have food resources available again. Some of the damage that you went through may not be healed or cured or be the way it was before your starving mode. I like to watch that show called Frozen. I think it was called Frozen. It's on Hulu. But it's a reality show where it talks about contestants that live in an area, secluded area. They're kind of like taken by helicopter to the secluded area of the islands, and then they have to survive on their own. And they're only allowed to bring 10 personal items of some sort to survive. Okay, and they're left there for days, and whoever survived the longest will win $500,000. But so, there are some contestants where they're like, it's my second time coming here, and I have some irreversible or things that are just not working as they should anymore. And some of those people that come back ends up leaving early sometimes because they realize, wait a minute, this is what last time when I was starving, can't find food, can't hunt food, this was what has been done to my body. So they're really putting their life on the line when you're talking about, or their health on the line when you're joining those survival competitions or shows. So make sure, I mean, I don't recommend it. Like, according to this, we now know what the human body needs, and you can't just deprive your body of that for an extended amount of time. You might have things that will never be the way it was, even if you get nourished again afterwards. So this is a good picture that summarizes what the things that can happen if you're malnutrition for, long periods of time. You can have problems with ventilation, which is breathing. So your loss of muscles, like I said, loss of proteins from your muscles will shrink. That can lead to hypoxic responses, not enough oxygen, impaired liver function, um, which can, lead to fatty change or necrosis, which is, your flesh starting to die and from the inside the body, tissues dying, etc. Impaired gut integrity and immunity, decreased immunity, resistance, and infection. Of course, if you don't have enough nutrients, how do you expect your immune system to be functioning correctly? Your immunity would definitely go down, get sick more often. And then impaired wound healing. We already said all those essential vitamins are important for clotting purposes and wound healing purposes. So you can't do those properly as well. Psychology, of course, the behavior and mental states, the fact that it's also affecting your brain. Your brain needs ATP constantly. Your brain needs to make neurotransmitter constantly. So that puts your brain in the mindset that it might not be right as well. Reduced cardiac output. Your heart is not going to be having enough energy to pump properly. Impaired renal function, which has to do with urinary system. You can't filter maybe or reabsorb nutrients as you should, or if you have nutrients at all in this point. And reduce strength, of course, because you lost your skeletal muscles, and hypothermia, because part of what keeps us warm, as I've mentioned before, is metabolism. Metabolism of food molecules is what keeps our body temperature at a homeostasis state. So when you don't have enough metabolism, it can be colder for you. All right. So assessing human nutrition and its insights actually come from a particular study called epidemiology. Okay. Epidemiology is talking about study of human health and also diseases at a population level. So it's like a macro scale level of human health. Instead of just zooming in on just one person's anatomy and physiology, we're talking about massive population diseases, pandemics, epidemics, etc. That's all part of epidemiology. And and this is a very good example of what I talked about earlier about folic acid. So back in 1970s, there were researchers within the epidemiology department that discovered children that were born to women of low socioeconomic status were more likely to have neural tube defects. So this is usually due to the tissue failing to enclose the developing brain and spinal cord. Remember, we talked about in terms of the gastrula, blastula formation, and it starts to form that indentation at the top. Remember, that's the ectoderm, and then you have this hollow space that's supposed to be generated, and eventually these two areas should close up, and then you form your little neural tube at the top of the blastula like that, or gastrula like that. So that if that somehow didn't close properly and it remains open like that, and now you have a gaping neural tube that is just open, oops, open like that, then that's a big problem. So that can lead to a condition called spinal bifida, which is where the actual either the spinal cord itself or what we call the meningeal layers that covers the spinal cord can actually protrude out of the babies like that. When the baby is born, you will see a portion of its nervous system, either the brain sometimes or the spinal cord, is because of, the skin and outside surfaces did not fuse properly. The neural tube didn't fuse properly, and it causes that particular part of the body to, protrude out into the opening. So, of course, there's open brain, open spinal cord, herniation of the cranial or spinal and meninges. So, this is talking about herniation of the dura mater, which is the outer meningeal layer of the spinal cord or the brain. Sometimes occipital skull or spine can have defects. So occipital skull is the bone in the back of the skull right here in this particular area. So sometimes you will see a malformation of that or deformity of that of some sort, such that the head doesn't shape properly. It's a pretty severe condition when we're talking about neural tube defects. Thankfully, there was an English scientist named Richard Smithles, which discovered vitamin supplementation led to a greatly reduced risk of such neural tube defects. So he was able to obtain evidence that the specific vitamin that is essential for preventing this particular disease or minimize the chances of these neural tube defects was folic acid, which was vitamin B9 that we talked about. And hence that led to a movement or a program in 1998, and that's not too long ago if you think about it. United States began to require folic acid to be added to enrich grain products, which is used to make bread and cereals and other products. So now they have folic acid embedded into those items, which they have now evidence and documents that actually show and support this hypothesis that folic acid decreases the chance of babies having neural tube defects. It was a very, very successful program in reducing the frequency of neural tube defects, and all of this, it was all due to somebody that wanted to study human health and disease at the population level, participating in the epidemiology departments of human health, which is very critical. I mean, even though in this day and age we talk about microsurgeries, new instrumentation, or advancement in diagnostic imaging techniques, that, these are things that make it to the headlines on health news, but we must not forget sometimes just a simple dietary change by adding folic acid may be among the greatest contributions to human health as a whole population level. Okay, so or sometimes even we're talking about global population health. So it is very important area of study when we're talking about our digestive system, human health, and diets. All right, so animals must process food. So because we said, okay, even though if you're herbivore, omnivore, or carnivores, those are big pieces or big complex macromolecule that you're ingesting. Our bodies can't use macromolecules as it is. Our bodies need to break it down, which is why I talked about that example of Lego sets versus Lego pieces. You take that big Lego piece, you can't use it because it doesn't fit your purpose. You have to break apart that Lego set in order for you to rebuild the Lego set that is usable for your own purpose. So which is why you have the food process stages. There are 4 stages of food processing. You have ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. Absorption and elimination we'll talk more about when we get to those particular organs responsible for those 2 particular steps. Ingestion, again, we'll talk about mouth, oral cavity, etc. Digestion is then your stomach and your small intestine. So ingestion can be defined as the act of eating or feeding. Different animals may have different feeding mechanisms, and this is what that's kind of gives you a glimpse of how how much of a difference it can be between different animals. For humans, of course, we know we eat with our mouth, and then we use hands and tools to tear and shred up pieces of big food and cook it so that we can ingest it properly. But for other animals that don't have hands or tools to use, they have other types of feeding. So This particular example right here is talking about humpback whale, where we have animals that are called filter or suspension feeders. We keep talking about this before in the previous chapters too, when we were talking about invertebrates, vertebrates, etc. These are when we're talking about filter or suspension feeding, we're talking about those organisms that strain smaller things from going into the to go into their mouth, or filter food particles to go into their mouth or digestive system of some sort from the surrounding environment, whether it be water, usually being water in this case. So humpback whale, their upper jaw actually have these feathery like things that kind of dangles from the upper part of the jaw. These are actually called baleen. Baleen will remove any small invertebrates and fishes from the water and mud that they just, ingest as a whole. So they just open their mouth and let that water pass through their mouth, and then whatever their baleen is able to catch and filter out, they will eat that for their energy resource. Second type of ingestion method for animals is substrate feeding. Substrate feeding means is when the animal themselves live in or on the food source. So usually this is more common with insects, like the leaf miner caterpillar right here. It's actually a moth larva, which is why it's more common with insects. They eat through oak leaves for this specific species, and they leave a trail of feces as they're eating through the leaf. Of course, then they will move on. They will eat up on the leaf that they were living on and move on to the next leaf, etc. We also talked about fly maggots from a previous chapter. So we said about how some likes to live on apples versus some like to live on blueberries, but they both live on the habitat. Eat on the habitat that they're living in. So some fly maggots would actually burrow into animal carcasses as well. So there's those that go with fruits, but there's those that go with fleshy, decaying matter. Um, and then this actually brings up a very interesting point in anatomy and physiology, medical method that we use. Even though you're like, ooh, fly maggots, they eat rotting flesh. But turns out that there is medical grade fly maggots that we use for a medical procedure called maggot debridement therapy. If you're interested, feel free to look it up. But if you want to look up YouTube videos, be aware you might be grossed out by all the maggots in the flesh. But if you're interested, wanting to know, go ahead and search up on it and read more about it. It's very interesting. Because when we're talking about people with rotting tissues on their body, rotting foot, rotting hand, if we don't stop that rotting from keep going on, because sometimes rotting can be by diabetes can cause that. The other resource is insect bites. So a particular spider's venom, if you get bitten by that spider, it will start the necrosis process in that area. And if you leave it alone, it will just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, you have to cut your whole arm off or cut your leg off. So, to prevent amputations, they have to get rid of that area of necrosis tissue, necrotic tissues. So what they do is they used to, have to slice off or surgically remove those necrotic tissues. But it turns out that nothing takes away necrotic tissues better than these maggots do. Somehow these maggots literally only loves necrotic tissues, dying tissues. They don't like new and fresh tissues. So they would put a bunch of, newly young maggots into the wound, patch it up with some bandages, leave them in there for a few days, and then they would open it back up and wash out the wound, and they will find that it's full of really, chunky maggots because they've just been feeding on all that necrotic tissues. But what's left behind is on the leg or the affected arm is just really nice, healthy tissues where all the necrotic tissues are gone. You don't even need to cut anything, surgically remove anything. It's just the maggots doing their thing. And it's a common practice in, areas where they don't have advanced access to medical care, because of course using maggots for this particular purpose is a lot cheaper compared to actual surgeries, etc. So these maggots have their own little use in medical field, kind of like how I talked about slime and also with the leeches, etc. It's all the wonders of the species we have all over the earth. Okay, so then fluid feeding is where animals actually suck nutrient-rich fluid from from the living host. So this is where they don't eat the flesh, they don't tear muscles off, they just like the fluid part, which is usually blood in this case for animals. So Sisi, which is an insect that like to pierce human skin like mosquitoes do, and they have hollow needle-like mouth parts that can feed and suck on the blood of their host. Like I said, kind of like mosquitoes, but they look a lot different. I mean, to me, that looks like a fly, but they are Sisi bugs that can, suck blood from their hosts. Aphids is actually then another type of fluid feeding type of species, insects in this case, and they like to feed on the plant's phloem sap. Remember, we talked about xylem and phloem of plants. So some insects love to dig a hole or punch a hole in those phloem. Remember, we talked about them being kind of like blood vessels for our human body. They are the vessels for plants. So they would actually, penetrate the phloem, and then they suck up the sap from within to literally eating the life out of the plants, which is why aphids are actually considered as pests on plants. I've never deal with them, thankfully, but I've seen people struggle with them with house plants, where some aphids just infestation had went on with their plants, and all of the plants died off, which is a sad story. So aphid is a type of pest in that sense. But there are good ones, good insects for fluid feeding, where pollinators, technically speaking, they are also fluid feeders because they feed on nectar of flowers or fruits. So in this case, it's not a bad problem because they are beneficial. Because remember, pollinators will sort of attach some pollen on their body while they're feeding on the nectar, and then when they fly on another flower to feed on that nectar, they will sort of pollinate that particular flower with the pollen that's stuck on their body, etc. So it can be a mixture of fluid feeding species. Last but not least, you have bulk feeding. Bulk feeding is what we are as humans. So animals eat large pieces of food using tentacles, pincers, claws, fangs, jaws, teeth. Of course, we don't have tentacles, but we have hands, appendages, that allows us to tear food. Imagine, again, think back the caveman age where you have to make your own tools. If you don't have tools, hands is all you got to feed and hunt for whatever food resources you can have. So humans are considered as bulk feeders. This particular example right here is pretty scary. It's actually a python. This is a python, a snake species that can ingest a whole antelope by swallowing it whole. Because snakes don't have little teeth to grind on flesh or tear flesh off from its prey. So a lot of times snakes like to ingest the entire organism into its mouth, into its body. So in this case, remember we talked about snakes' adaptation to their food source is that they have lower jaws that are loosely hinged such that they can really open their jaws really wide. And there's elastic ligaments that helps with that and allows their mouth, their throat to open this extreme width. And then that allows them to ingest whatever large prey they need to ingest. It might take a whole hour to ingest that particular antelope like that. This particular antelope is called gazelle, is a specific species of, antelopes, but they can ingest that. They might take a while, okay, slowly pushing it into its body, but once it's ingested, the whole thing after that 1 hour, this snake can go on for 2 weeks or more without having to eat again because it would take 2 weeks for them to just digest and metabolize all that flesh into energy building blocks that they need to survive. So they can't chew, but they can swallow the whole thing whole, which is why snakes have fangs usually that can either punch the animal in their blood vessels so they bleed to death, or there's venoms that comes out of their fangs that can immobilize or poison, kill off the animal so that they can slowly ingest it with all the time they have once the animal is dead or immobilized. All right, it is 1 hour, 13 minutes, so good topics will fly by quickly. I will stop right here and continue in part two.